The Elder Scrolls universe is beloved by many as far as fantasy universes go. But unlike some other fantasy worlds, like that of Tolkien's Middle-earth, Tamriel is rather underdeveloped in the area I'd like to talk about today, linguistics. The world of Nirn is home to many languages that we are mostly told about through when the writing demands it. By contrast, Tolkien created fully fledged constructed languages, or conlangs, for his elves, as well as slightly less developed conlangs for hobbits, men, and dwarves. That's not to say there aren't linguistic elements explored in the games and the world, but we have overall very little information about the conlangs present in the Outer Scrolls. This is why I wanted to try my best to compile some of that information in this video. The first important thing to note is that in addition to there being a lack of information, there is also sometimes conflicting information, or at least enough of a lack of information to allow for conflicting interpretations, which are sometimes presented as fact on places like the unofficial Elder Scrolls pages. That all being said, we have a pretty good idea of where the languages of mortals come from, a proto-language known as Elnifex. This was the language of the Elnife, who are the spirits who are the progenitors of the mortal races of Nirn in lore. This makes sense, of course. In real life, proto-languages were spoken by the common ancestors of speakers of the descendant languages. In the real world of historical linguistics, there are various theories, usually on the fringe of the academic mainstream, mind you, that group various language families into hypothetical macro-families. These would be your Nostratic and Altaic languages. While these are on the fringe of mainstream historical linguistics, as I said, there's a case to be made that the core concept behind them is sound, and we just can't actually reconstruct any of the macrofamilies that may or may not exist. But if we developed language when we were still relatively homogeneous as a species and not too spread out, it would not be too out of the question to claim that all languages are somehow descended from a single proto-language that would create one big macrofamily. The problem, of course, is that there's no strong evidence for that proto-language, so we're stuck with, by comparison, smaller groupings like Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic as our top-level families. Of course, don't let any linguist hear you talking about this because they'll probably think you're crazy. But we don't know exactly what point in our history we first developed language. There are many studies on this matter, one notable one from just this year placing around 135,000 years ago as the starting point for language capabilities. This does cause some problems for a supposed proto-language, though, because we are pretty sure that humans were already quite well dispersed throughout Africa at that point. Not to mention that if Homo sapiens weren't the only human species to develop language, we have a whole other can of worms about whether there was influence on Homo sapien language from other human species. We don't have such a problem in the world of the Elder Scrolls because we know that the Elnife had a common language, and then the mortal races of Nirn are descended from them, with the exception of Argonians, who have their own unrelated language, Gel. That's not to say there are no problems with this framework. We don't have a super good grasp on how Elnifex words shifted into the various modern languages of Tamriel, and this is especially true of some of the languages, such as Yakuden and Slode. There are some words that pretty clearly connect some of the languages together, such as Talos being an Elnifex at Morin and Aldmeris, but these suffer from the weird problem of just being the same word. In the real world, a Proto-Indo-European word like woder went through various sound changes to become the English water. I hope I said the Proto-Indo-European word right. You can correct me in the comments if I said it wrong. So it seems plausible that Talos and Elnifex would not be pronounced the same way as Talos and Morin, but we have no actual evidence for that being the case, which doesn't mean that Morin isn't descended from Elnifex, but certainly makes it less clear as to how it is. So we know that Elnifex is what most languages descend from, but we're faced with one more big problem, which is that there are very few known words in Elnifex to connect to the other languages. We know that Akka means dragon, from which Akatosh and Akavir derive, but why is Tamriel Starry Heart in Elnifex but Dawn's Beauty in Aldmeris? Presumably, this is a relexification of Star as Dawn and Heart as Beauty, given that we know that Tam, part of Tamriel, is Dawn in Aldmeris, implying that Riel is Beauty. So, we relexify those two words to become Dawn's Beauty instead of Starry Heart. This is where things get really tricky with Elnifex because it is clear there wasn't a whole lot of linguistic thought put into the development of these languages. Fantasy writers often just come up with cool sounding words and leave analysts to pick up the pieces in the sense retroactively. I mean, it doesn't not make sense for something to do with a star to become associated with the dawn, but did they really think of that? I don't know. I won't get too much more into the expansive dictionaries of languages like High Elvish, at least not in this video, because I want to move on to the non-Elnifex stuff. But I will show you this interesting chart and some, as well as some dictionaries from the UESP of various languages in the Outer Scrolls that have more expansive dictionaries. This chart was made by someone on, I believe, the Project Tamriel Discord, and can be found on the UESP website. It does its best to connect the languages of the Elnifex genetically and give some real or fantastical counterparts that inspired each language. There are a few other non-Elnifex languages in addition to Gel, including the Dragon language, which influenced the Nordic tongue. This is what I really would like to focus on for the rest of the video for two reasons. For the first one being that it is perhaps the most well-known conlang from the Outer Scrolls due to Skyrim's immense popularity, and two, it is one of the better developed conlangs in the Outer Scrolls. So there's a few things that I'd like to talk about with the dragon language. The first is phonology, which is that it has phonemic vowel length and differentiates between long and short vowels in the writing system. To serve is different from lion. The grammar of the dragon language is not super well explored, but we know a fair few things. Pluralizing comes from repeating the last letter of a word and adding e, so that would be kel becoming kelele. Possession is similar to Semitic languages in the real world, that suffixes in the way that suffixes are added to display possession. So that would be e or u usually, depending on who is possessing the thing. Perfect verb forms are indicated by an on suffix. Verb tense is often ignored. Compound words are often used in our head initial, meaning that the more important word in the compound comes first. We have a pretty long list of words in the Dragon Languages lexicon, which I won't list all of, but there's something that I found very interesting about one of the words in particular, and hopefully will be interesting to you as well. Kine in the Dragon language is referred to as Khan. This is mostly interesting because it allows for some interesting historical linguistics. Kine is the Nordic name and aspect of the divine Kinnereth. The Nordic language is partially descended from Atmoran and partially descended from the Dragon language. You can probably guess where this is going. Khan probably went through a sound change between the Dragon language and Nordic to become Kine. Then, as the Nordic religion influenced the later Alessian pantheon of divines, the name became Kinnereth. Now, this is just my personal theory of what happened, but it seems to make sense to me. The one kind of thorn in my side with this theory is that Ta'agra, or Khajiiti, word for Kinnereth, also sounds suspiciously similar to Kinnereth, which is Canarthi. So it doesn't just seem out of the question that Kinnereth is just an Elnifex derivation, and Khan happens to fit with the first theory by chance, or it happened reverse to what I said, and Kine was borrowed from the Atmorans into the Dragon language as Khan. These two theories both make some amount of sense, and I mostly lean towards the first one because as far as I know the pre-Alessian pantheon needs did not worship Kinnereth and Cyrodiil, implying that the worship of Kinnereth among men comes directly from the Nords, but that's just some weird lore making sense of it that I had to do. There is also the slight interesting thing, which is that since the Elnofey were at Ada and Aedra by definition, the Aedra probably had their own language in which they had their own names for themselves. So it could just be that in the language of the Aedra, in whatever Aedric or Edadan language Kinnereth was named Proto-Kinnereth, right? And then it descended into Atmoran as Kine. It descended into Ta'agra as Canarthi, and it descended into Eliadun maybe even as Kinnereth. And then we still have that same thing of like Khan coming from Kine being a borrowing into the Dragon language from the Nordic language. So that's the evidence for why the second theory might make more sense. But I prefer the first theory just for personal lore reasons, but it doesn't have to be true. So what is there really to say about the linguistics of the Outer Scrolls? Well, in short, so that it's not very in-depth, but there's a lot of words. Like, we don't know a lot about what the words do, who speaks the languages, how the languages became different languages, but there are a lot of words, like that's for sure. And there are a lot of expansive dictionaries for these languages. They're just not very useful for actually determining anything linguistically. There is certainly some amount of effort into making the languages feel real, but not nearly enough for my liking. That said, there are some interesting things to see, and I would be very excited if they expand on the languages more in the Outer Scrolls 6. This video is mostly spawned out of my desire to look more into what is there, and while it's not much, it's still something I enjoyed doing. If you have any suggestions for other videos, please let me know. I'll probably talk about Tolkien at some point. I'll probably talk more about the Elder Scrolls. I'll probably talk about just anything linguistic that comes to mind, or anything in general that comes to mind. But if you have any specific ideas for a video, maybe I'll talk about more in depth some of the specific languages from the Elder Scrolls. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.